How much poverty is there in the US? How often does it happen? What sections of society experience more of it? And what tools and efforts do we use to address it? Most incidences of poverty are temporary. People experience some bad luck, enter into poverty, and after some time are able to improve. In fact, over the course of a lifetime, just over a majority of Americans will experience poverty at some point. Now let's see how different corners of society experience poverty. Both men and women generally experience poverty at similar rates, while women are slightly higher. The older one gets, the less we experience poverty. Very concerning are the high rates of childhood poverty. Did any of these children make choices that led to this? Definitionally, no. They are not of the age of majority and do not have the legal or moral capacity to improve their economic well-being. The type of family and relationship one has significantly correlates with poverty rates. Married couples have a very low poverty rate. Two committed adults are able to plan for the future and share resources. And while single dads have a poverty rate similar to the whole country, single moms have an extraordinarily high poverty rate. They are a very vulnerable portion of society, needing a lot more support than the current system provides. Seeing how poverty rates differ by race, the poverty rate doubles for blacks and Hispanics, and nearly a quarter of Native Americans experience poverty. The quantity of education is heavily correlated with poverty. No high school degree results in a 25% rate. Graduating high school brings you just above the national rate. Some college is just below, and completing a bachelor's degree yields a very low poverty rate. As we would expect, if one is working, you'll experience less poverty. Being employed is the primary source of income for most. Those who are employed overall have a poverty rate of 4.8%. If you're working full-time, that's 1.9%. Part-time is a little above the national average, and those who are not working experience the highest poverty rate we've seen at over 30%. These numbers will fluctuate up and down depending on whether we're in a recession or not. And of course, we've seen the long-run trend has been improving over the past 60 years. But there's still something curious to note about this particular graph. Although full-time poverty rates are very small at just below 2%, it does beg a certain question. If someone is working full-time, they can't work harder. That's the definition of full-time. Their working time is full. And so many in society ask if someone is going to work 40 hours a week, they should not earn poverty wages. So, in nearly every moral system, every religion, every cultural tradition, nearly every moral philosopher over the millennia, note that society has a moral obligation to address poverty. We can split these efforts up largely into two camps: private donations and charity versus public government efforts. In the United States, private donations amount to around $500 billion a year. And it's important to note that this number will include donations to rich foundations, donations to universities. The vast majority are donations to churches, which, while churches do engage in anti-poverty efforts, the majority of religious donations go towards simply keeping the lights on for those organizations. A much larger component are the efforts from the government. The largest anti-poverty program is Social Security for the elderly. We spend well over $1 trillion a year on that. Medicare comes in at $900 billion a year. Food stamps and housing subsidies are a relatively small portion. And we have many other programs as well, each a smaller amount. Altogether, the government efforts to fight poverty amount to trillions of dollars a year. Do recall that the size of the American economy is nearly $27 trillion, and when 10 to 20% are economically struggling, spending in the trillions is required to address it. While there does exist a broad political and moral diversity within the economics profession, the vast majority are in favor of some sort of government effort to fight poverty. Here I'm going to quote again from libertarian economist Friedrich Hayek. He wrote a very famous book in the 1940s called The Road to Serfdom, arguing against socialism and against government takeover of the private sector. And yet he still noted there is a role of government for a safety net. There is no reason why a society which has reached the general level of wealth which ours has, the first kind of security, should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom. There is a difficult question about the precise standard which should thus be assured, but there can be no doubt that some minimum of food, shelter, and clothing sufficient to preserve health and the capacity to work can be assured to everybody. And today, more or less, most discussions about a public safety net are debating about the details of it, usually not whether we should get rid of it altogether. These programs are part of a social safety net. Social simply means it serves all of society. and a safety net to help catch people when they experience bad luck, working towards having all experience the same opportunities. Sometimes we call this a public insurance. A few examples of this are unemployment insurance, disability insurance, public health insurance, such as Medicare and Medicaid, food and housing subsidies. Another large one is the Earned Income Tax Credit, and as mentioned, Social Security for the elderly. And we can roughly split these up into two categories: means tested versus universal. There are advantages and disadvantages with each. Means tested is more targeted. Only people with needs participate. Food stamps, for example. You have to demonstrate your income with documentation. You have to show that your bank account is below a certain amount and that you don't have other assets. The advantage is these programs are more efficient. Only those who need it get it. It costs the taxpayer less money to service it. The disadvantage is there's more paperwork. There's more administrative burden. We have to hire government employees to go over the papers and verify it and make sure everything checks out. And the primary disadvantage and critique of this approach is you will get people with needs who will fall through the cracks because of these bureaucratic hurdles. The most vulnerable in society will be the least capable to navigate a complex red tape and bureaucracy. A universal safety net is provided to all. Social Security is the largest example. Every person who has reached a certain age, as long as you have worked a minimum amount during your lifetime, will receive Social Security, regardless of whether you are rich, middle income, or poor. During the pandemic, we had both varieties. We had unemployment insurance, which only goes to those who were laid off, very, very targeted. And we also had stimulus checks that went out to everybody. Again, the advantage was not everybody who laid off was able to file unemployment paperwork, get it through the system, finally receive a check in time to meet their needs. And so these universal stimulus checks did go out to some people who didn't need them, but also went out to some people who desperately needed them, who had yet to complete the administrative process to collect unemployment insurance. Some type of social safety net is simply in cash. Other times it's a specific good or service. SNAP, or commonly called food stamps, can only pay for unprepared food, like groceries. Incidentally, Papa Murphy's is considered unprepared because you could take it home and bake it. But fully created meals at the grocery store are prepared and food stamps won't cover them. The very effective Earned Income Tax Credit, as well as the Child Tax Credit, are simply just cash savings from tax obligations. Let's go through some numbers for these programs. Medicaid and CHIP are the largest. This pays for low-income healthcare. There are 94 million recipients, which is around 28% of the population. Monthly government expenditure is around $700 a month. Social Security goes to 67 million recipients and is the largest benefit at an average of $1,700 a month. Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly, notice this number is much larger than it is for Medicaid. This is because the elderly will require, on average, more healthcare expenditures relative to the younger, lower incomes. Food stamps go to 40 million Americans. This is around 12% of the population, with an average per person expenditure of $230 a month. The Earned Income Tax Credit goes to 30 million, housing assistance goes to 9 million, supplemental security income, known as SSI, which largely serves the disabled population, and finally unemployment insurance, which presently serves around 2 million people, offering a very modest $400 a month on average. As you can see from all of these figures, none of them by themselves are enough to live off of in any comfortable way. Most of these payments are simply supplementary, enough to help either existing savings, existing networks, or existing low incomes to help achieve a standard of living above poverty. Another way the federal government redistributes income is via the federal income tax. On your left here is a schedule of the marginal tax rates based upon the taxable income. So defining terms here is very important. Taxable income is only the portion of your income that is subject to tax. Everybody can take a standard deduction, which presently is almost $14,000, that goes 100% tax-free. It's not even included in this chart. There's also an option to itemize your taxes, meaning your itemized deductions could be even higher than the standard deduction. This can apply for folks who have experienced catastrophic health, as well as the more wealthy who have very large homes or multiple homes. Under current law, the mortgage interest is tax deductible. The next vocabulary word is the marginal tax rate. The marginal rate only applies to the next bracket. So, for example, everybody's first taxable income of $11,000 is taxed at 10%, no matter how rich or how poor you are. The next gap between $11,000 and $44,000 is taxed at 12% for everybody. So it's just this $34,000 chunk that is taxed at 12%. Once income is earned higher than that, the rate goes up to 22%, but only for that additional income, not for the previous income. After 95,000, it goes to 24. After 182,000, it goes to 32. After 230, nearly $250,000, it goes to 35. And again, that 35% only applies to any income above 230,000. And then finally, after 570,000, the marginal rate bumps up to 37. I should also make a brief note that these numbers are for a single person. If you are a couple filing jointly or in a family, basically everything doubles. So a couple would need to earn over $500,000 before they even start to experience a 35% marginal tax rate. A very wealthy individual still only pays 10% for the first $10,000 of taxable income, and to emphasize, they only pay the 37% rate for incomes higher than $500,000. This type of a tax schedule is progressive, not in the political progressive versus conservative, but in the mathematical progressive versus regressive. A progressive tax rate just means the higher one's income, the higher the proportion gets taxed. And this is a way to reduce income inequality. Not all taxes are progressive. A sales tax by itself is a regressive tax. Everyone pays the same amount. Here in the state of Washington, we pay 6.5%, regardless of our level of income. But because not everybody spends the same proportion of their income on consumption goods, the marginal tax rate ends up being much higher for lower incomes. You can see what I mean with the following example. Check out this chart. It's about grocery budgets. On the horizontal axis, it says how many dollars per year are spent buying groceries. Each dot represents an income decile. So the bottom 10%, the next 20%, all the way up to the top 10%. And as we can see, the more income one has, the more they spend on groceries. Instead of buying foods at a discount store, they buy their groceries at Whole Foods. And somewhere in the middle there are those who are shopping at Walmart, Aldi, and Safeway. Don't forget Winco. But this vertical axis is the whole story. Note that even though the poorest 10%, the poorest 20% are spending a lot less per year on groceries, it ends up being a significantly higher portion of their total budget. The lowest 20% are spending nearly 18% of their annual budget just on groceries, whereas the poorest 10% are spending nearly 40% of their income, almost half. And the richest 10%, even though they're spending $7,000 a year, they're only spending 2 to 3% of their entire budget buying groceries. So if we had a sales tax that was the same for everybody, we'd really run into some fairness problems. A regressive tax is when lower incomes pay a higher share of income in taxes. The consumption sales tax, which we are discussing, is one example. Payroll taxes are also like this. Regardless of how rich or poor you are, almost everybody pays the same 7+% of their paycheck towards payroll taxes. And there's an exception to this. Under current law, the Social Security marginal tax rate turns to 0% for any income above 160. So if your salary is above 160,000 a year, you pay Social Security tax like everybody else for the first $160,000 you earn. But for any monies earned addition to that, go Social Security tax-free. There's some arguments out there for it. Some folks want to treat it as a private retirement fund. You're only going to get so much back, so you shouldn't have to pay too much into it. The counter argument, of course, is that it's not a private retirement account. It is a society-level retirement account. And if any tax breaks should exist there at all, it shouldn't be for the most well-off. Because everybody, no matter how poor you are, if you work, you pay Social Security taxes. Nevertheless, if you add up all of these regressive taxes and all the progressive taxes, both at the federal level and also at the state level, the entire tax system is progressive. The higher your income, the higher percent you pay in taxes, reflecting your higher ability to afford it.